Hi, everyone. This is Tina Ramirez, and I'm really excited to have with us today Naomi Kikoler from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. She's the director of genocide prevention there, and she's someone that I've known for many years since my work with Congress on the genocide bill that related to what happened in Iraq.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Tina, and it's been a pleasure to work with you and your team over the years. It's a really good question. I sometimes say that, in a way I was kind of born into doing this work and didn't feel necessarily like I had a lot of choice, in part because I personally feel very strongly that we have a responsibility to others. And I grew up in a family where I heard a lot of stories that I just simply don't want anyone else ever to hear. On my father's side of the family, my paternal grandparents are Holocaust survivors. They both survived Auschwitz. My grandmother thankfully managed to survive with two sisters, being in a number of different camps, and then the Death March, and was liberated in Ravensbrück. She unfortunately lost her parents and was separated from her brothers. One brother, it was something like 30 years that passed between, close to 30 years in which they had last seen him, and then they learned that he was still alive within the USSR at the time. And on my mother's side of the family, my mother's family was involved in the Danish resistance, and they were Christian. And I was very moved from a young age by the idea that we can't be bystanders. We really do have to live our lives in accordance with our own moral compass and belief, and try to affect positive change for others. And my grandmother's brother was executed in his early 20s for being part of a Danish resistance movement. And in Denmark, what they did was each person before they were executed was allowed to write one letter home to their family members. And he wrote a letter to his mother, where he basically said that he was a very religious person and they were a religious family. And he said that you have to fight for what you believe in, and that he had no regrets, that he knew that he would see them again in heaven, and that the purpose of his life and of his death was to basically do what he believed was, kind of God's work, and to try to help. And it really resonated because, on my father's side of the family, I had grown up with just these horrific accounts of what life was like in the Warsaw Ghetto. My grandmother survived the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, which meant that, she had really lived through some of the most difficult moments when Jews had been sent to the ghetto and forced to live in just absolutely horrific environments. And they somehow, against all odds, survived. And she would start almost every sentence with the term "God willing," and to understand from her vantage point, it was very clear why she would say that. My grandfather could not talk about his experience, so I grew up just with complete silence, and in a way that almost had a more profound effect, because he was the sole surviving member of his family. There was no one, no one in his immediate family, no one in his extended family that survived. And I grew up just seeing very closely, in a very intimate way, what post-traumatic stress disorder looks like, what profound loss looks like. And so those two backgrounds really defined, in large part, my sense of purpose, which I feel, both incredibly fortunate for, but I also wish that no one else ever has to grow up with a similar background, because the reality, and we talk about this as an institution, is that the legacy is multi-generational. For those who are forced from their homes in Sinjar, Karakush, and Iraq, it's not just them, but it's their children, their grandchildren that will bear those scars. For the Rohingya today, for the Uyghurs, and to be persecuted simply on the basis of what you were born or what you believe, is such a painful, all violence is painful, but there is something that has always struck a chord for me, because of that background. So I went to Rwanda. I started when I was about 16. I did a project on Rwanda, and I had this kind of moment where I thought, my gosh, if something like this can happen today, what does never again actually mean? And never again is actually one of my least favorite terms, because in my mind, it simply means ever and ever and ever again. So I have basically spent the last 20 plus years trying to either understand through studying the phenomenon of genocide and large scale crimes against humanity, or working on it. I became a human rights lawyer, and have really tried to tackle this issue from as many different vantage points as possible, because I believe that these crimes are preventable. I believe we have each a responsibility to do what we can. And I feel very fortunate to be able to be in the space that I am, working with people like you and your team, and with just remarkable also survivors from around the world, to try to make sure that not only does the world not forget them or deny the commission of the crimes, but that the world does something to stop them. So that's a little bit about my background.
It's so amazing hearing your story, and I what I'm sad about is that so many people in those generations that lived through and experienced those things are not with us anymore. And so I think it's harder and harder for people to relate to that, to the Holocaust in particular, and to understand why we have to be so vigilant against anything like that in every generation. One thing, Naomi, so about me that you may not know is when I was a school teacher before I did anything in Washington. And I had just come out of doing my master's in international human rights over in England at the University of Essex. And I did my, well, actually it was before I went there, I'm sorry, but my first master's was in education. And I had studied in Strasbourg, France, international human rights. And I wanted to know what the impact of teaching human rights to children would be. So I actually did this study with my 8th grade history students who were learning about the Holocaust and learning about other genocides throughout history as well, like what happened to the Native Americans in our own country, but in particular the Holocaust. And one of the things that we were looking at was how did people in that culture go from A to Z? Like, how did people become willing to commit such atrocities against other human beings? And when you begin to look at that trajectory, which Holocaust studies do, which was a big component of my research at the time, you understand, like, it starts with really simple things like, what are you saying about somebody? How are you dehumanizing them? And that allowed me within my field of human rights education to be able to help my students understand you get there because of these little steps you take way back here. So our words matter. How we treat other people with dignity matters. Really basic steps that I feel like have been so much forgotten. But with the Holocaust Memorial Museum and the work that you all do, a lot of it is to prevent and to help people really, recognize those early warning signs so that they don't go down the path of committing these atrocities or becoming part of a culture that feels okay with that. That it's preventable. So can you share a little bit more about the work you do at the museum and how the museum has really approached this in a very different, unique way?
Yeah, no, I mean, everything you said just resonated really, really deeply with me. Our goal, what I like to often say, is that we do for communities today, or try to do for communities today, what was not done for Jews during the Holocaust, which means that we have a role to ring the alarm bells in advance of crimes occurring when we see the warning signs. And those warning signs can be seen, a decade in advance. It could be seen a year in advance. In the case of the Rohingya, we did a report that outlined the risk of genocide. That report came out in about 2015, I believe, 2015 or 2016, where we talked about exactly what you're talking about: demonizing communities, framing them as others, changing laws to strip them of their citizenship. Things that, in a way, when you think about it, hark back to the experience of Jews and others during the Holocaust. And, the other aspect of our work is to, if we think about, raising the alarm bells in the early 1930s, part of the job also is to, once the crimes are occurring, try to put a spotlight on those crimes, document them where it's possible, and try to galvanize action to try to protect vulnerable communities. Our mandate as an institution is unique. There are not a lot of Holocaust museums that work on contemporary issues. We see ourselves as a living memorial, and we were actually mandated by Congress. So we were born of a presidential commission, which makes us incredibly unique in that way. There was a desire to put on the National Mall in the United States a reminder of what is the kind of worst types of crimes that a government or a, now we know thanks to ISIS, a non-government entity can commit against a people, to be a living memorial to the survivors and victims, but also critically, and this is in the presidential commission that underpinned the foundation of the museum, to act as a moral voice of conscience for the United States. And that is a pretty big responsibility that we take very seriously as an institution, to try to draw attention and galvanize. So we focus on early warning. We have an early warning system that looks at all 193 countries and tries to anticipate where mass killing will occur. It uses the same type of information that the private intel community uses, but we try to make it public. That early warning project and the findings actually is now, through the Global Fragility Act, has created a requirement for the Department of State to refer to our list when considering countries that they need to prioritize for early action and early engagement. So we're happy to see that type of legislative change. We work to basically educate and advise. So we try to educate each administration and our colleagues on the Hill to understand the phenomenon of genocide and understand, as you say, these are processes. These are deliberate actions that are taken that can result in the types of crimes that we're talking about, but that there are interruption moments and mitigation strategies that can be taken. It gets a lot harder the longer you wait to respond to those warning signs, especially sadly, once the killings have already begun. And so our aim is to try to get people to act at a much earlier stage from a policy perspective. So we try to engage policymakers to help them understand the phenomenon and understand the tools that are available to them to help save lives. And we talk a lot about their own responsibility. If you are in a position of influence, if you have been elected, you carry an extra responsibility to try to use your platform to promote US values and promote what we think are humanistic values about making sure that these crimes do not occur. But we also have a component of our mandate that is to educate the American public. And so we have been using the physical space of the museum and our online platform, which is really important today, to tell stories. We had an exhibit for a number of years on Syria and the crimes that were being committed by the Assad regime there. Right now, we have just finished building a remarkable exhibit that tells a story of the genocide against the Rohingya. And if you go to our website, the Holocaust Museum's website, you can find Burma's Path to Genocide, our online story-telling experience that tells you about the horrific genocide that's been perpetrated there, because we believe that it's really important for the American public to know that 70 plus years after the Holocaust, crimes are still being committed, communities are still being targeted on the basis of their identity, and each of us have a responsibility to not just care, but ideally do something. So we take a multifaceted approach involving research, outreach, legal engagement, trying to help especially victim communities understand what their rights are. And again, that's all part of our belief that we aspire to do today for communities what was not done for Jews and others during the Holocaust.
Naomi, can you share a little bit about like just this early warning system is so important. We've seen it even in our own work I mean, if you look at Iraq, for instance, when I was working in Congress, I remember trying to like have hearing after hearing saying, hey, religion needs to be a red line because if it's not just a band-aid, you've got to look at like this is part of one of the root causes of all this conflict. Religious communities are being disproportionately affected. And you had like the Mandean population that went from 50,000 to under 5,000, literally within, a couple of years of the US engagement in Iraq. I mean, and that's just one community. And you look across the board at all the different communities that have been just affected by this, it's horrifying. And so, but year after year, regardless of the administration, no one took it seriously. No one wanted to redline the really the root causes of conflict or address them. And so, I mean, it was so frustrating. That's one of the reasons I started Hardwired was I felt like the people on the ground needed to be able to develop their own indigenous response or local response, and outside help often came too late. And so we would go in and help them develop a voice for themselves that wasn't just one religious community, but that was multifaceted,
Yeah.
so that all of the religious communities and different ethnic groups were able to see why this was in the best interest for them and not just for one particular group. Because that really, I mean, you could see the writing on the wall. I mean, obviously that's, no pun intended in Iraq, but in any country, I just feel like it's the warning signs are there, and policymakers are often the last to pay attention to them. And it's like, we always want to respond with a military humanitarian solution, but millions of lives or thousands can be lost by that point. And that's just, I don't feel like that's acceptable in this day and age. We should prepare and look at those warning signs. So Sudan is another country where we work. Can you share a little bit about just the early warning mechanism there? And that's one that maybe people are less familiar with. So I'd love for them to just hear, what does that look like with Sudan? What are those early warnings and what are you looking at there now?
So, I'll take a step back and just talk about the early warning system. It uses essentially two different components. One is that we do a statistical risk assessment. So we basically run a few algorithms using available data and different data sets that are coded specifically for us to help us look at a particular country and understand the vulnerabilities in the country. And they'll look at everything from the governance structure to even things like how engaged are various communities in the civic life of a particular country. There's a whole host of kind of different variables that are essentially crunched to try to help understand where a country falls in terms of its level of risk. That doesn't require granular kind of interviewing or engagement with communities on the ground. That's done at a very high level, but actually has a very high level of accuracy. It's mirrored with another system, which is a much more qualitative system, whereby experts are invited to participate, and we do kind of a wisdom of crowds approach, where they input also similarly where they think there are particular risks in a particular country. And that helps us to kind of better understand where we think that a particular country's vulnerabilities are. We have a third element, which allows us to do much deeper dives and to get a lot more of the granular information that you're talking about, where we have early warning fellows and we send people usually to the particular country and work with partners on the ground. So we always have a researcher from the country in question, be it from Cote d'Ivoire or Mali, to help us better understand what we're seeing in the statistical risk assessment and in the kind of wisdom of crowd findings, and layer that onto the local reality. We haven't done that in the context of Sudan and South Sudan. Our work there is a little bit different. We actually work with partners to help to maintain a coalition, a victims-driven justice coalition, and through them are able to get a lot of information about what is happening where within the country. I think, your broader point is a really important one that needs to be kind of stressed. Often it isn't an absence of information, it's an absence of attention. And we're trying to change that calculus by bringing as robust and cutting edge kind of technology to the early warning signs to policymakers to say, if you don't, and I hate to say this, but you've lived this, if you don't take seriously what this Sabian Mendean representative who went to the embassy and risked their life to go is telling you, here is additional information to back up what they are kind of stressing, and to require and mandate government officials to, at a much earlier stage, look at those warning signs. Ideally, what we're hoping is that with our system, it's also helping to empower local communities so they have another tool that they can use when they do their outreach, but also guide foundations and civil society on how they're going to fund. Because I think your point that you made before is so critically important. We need to be creating allyship amongst communities. We need to be finding ways for their voices to resonate so they can actually have a seat at the table. You mentioned the Mandaean community. The fact that there actually was considerable information, even about such a small community, where we could see the way they were being targeted in Baghdad. We could see that the fact that when they go to worship, they wear white, they go to a river, it puts them at heightened risk, they become targets. Those are things that should be factoring into any embassy officials' thinking when they're doing a mapping of particular communities at risk. the unfortunate reality for the Mandans, for the Christians, for the Yazidis and others is that within the narrative around Iraq, it became so focused on the Sunni Shia divide that 10% of the population were either seen as pawns to try to help offset or kind of manage the larger community's relations, or you would be confronted with arguments of why are you focusing on 10% of the population, which is heartbreaking because it goes exactly to your first point. These should not be political conversations that we have around the protection of vulnerable communities. It should be a conversation about their vulnerability. And I often talk about religious and also in some cases ethnic minorities as being the canaries in the coal mine, because when you start to see them being targeted, when you see their rights being stripped, being denied, when you start seeing members of their community disappearing, being kidnapped, young girls being targeted, that should be glaring, in my opinion, signs that should be triggering a clear policy response from local officials, from like-minded governments, because it suggests that there is something much more destabilizing that could potentially occur in a particular country. They should be protected in and of themselves because their lives merit that level of attention and protection, but also because, and Iraq is a perfect example to show just what the ramifications can be when you ignore all those signs. So, our hope is that with the early warning system, with the more granular analysis that we can do through the fellowships, with talking about the fact that there are communities that at times face unique vulnerabilities, we're moving it out of the realm of politics and making it more of rote responses, developing the muscle memory. So when you see certain things happen, you ideally see a more consistent type of response so that we don't get to the situation where you and I are sitting down with members of the Sabian Mandan community who have had to flee not only Baghdad and elsewhere in the south, but also have now had to flee Nineveh, and the future of their very survival is not just a potential, kind of reality. It is the reality that they are facing, given everything that they have endured. And this is a community that has managed to survive so much. So we hope that by explaining early warning and by explaining again that there are unique attributes, that there are communities where othering and demonization is more rampant and puts them at risk, will change the calculus that people who are sitting in the White House, who are sitting in Paris and elsewhere are considering when they think about how they engage in a particular country. So that we can help, again, as you have also mentioned in what your community, what your organization does so well, trying to help elevate their voice so they do have a seat at the table before the crimes happen.
There was a gentleman in Iraq that I got to meet. He's one of the top judges in Iraq and was in charge of the court for the victims of reparations of terrorism, to provide reparations to the victims of terrorism. And he had to flee Mosul during when ISIS occupied it. And he was a part of our trainings with different leaders in Iraq. And after a couple of the trainings, I was meeting with him one day and I asked him how he was doing. And he showed me this image on his phone, his cell phone, of his 17-year-old brother. All of his family were still back in Mosul, but his 17-year-old brother had been taken by ISIS and was being beheaded in the image. And I just, you can't look at that and not, not be moved in any way. And I remember asking him, what does this mean? And he said, well, it's a warning. And he's a Sunni Muslim judge. So I said, well, what does that mean for you? What are you going to be able to do? Because after our initial trainings, he went to the leaders of the Yazidis and the Christians and said, I'm going to defend you in the courts. And he was. And he was ensuring that they had justice. And then ISIS came after his family, and that's what they do. And he said to me something that I think really symbolizes what you're saying. He said, Tina, if I don't stand up, if I don't defend this freedom for others, then this is the reality that awaits every person in Iraq. And for me, and the reason I do what I do in Iraq and in other countries is because when you can get people to the table to begin to not just defend their own rights, but that of everyone around them, even at risk of their own life, even when they don't agree with the religious or the ethnic positions of the other, but they're really willing to see the dignity and the humanity of the other and stand hand in hand with them and fight for them, and their equal rights. That to me is the hope of our future.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that's what motivates me to keep doing what I'm doing, because like you said, in so many of these countries, if you would just see yourself um, as a human being, no different than the other, you wouldn't go down that dangerous road of demonizing the other, seeing them as an other, which is essentially what I saw in my classroom. And what we talked about was, how are you willing to treat them as the other, like you shared? How are you willing to denigrate them with your words, to discriminate, to mistreat, to start to be violent? And it escalates and escalates to the point where you're so numb to the violence against another group because they're just, they're not human like you are.
Yeah.
And that is a dangerous road in any society. And it's something that for us, when we look at prevention, it starts at like a really basic level of seeing the other person as a human being with equal rights and dignity. So
And that starts at home. That's the reality. I mean, it starts with at home in terms of each of us here in our day-to-day lives should live and embody that. And it starts at home in terms of the communities that we are working amongst and fortunate enough to be able to work with. One of the things that I find really fascinating is there's always divisions. There's always divisions within communities even. I think of the Jewish community, there's unbelievable divisions. There were during the Holocaust. There were even about what should be done. Like, should we talk about what is happening to, American Jews? We're debating, how much attention should we put on what's happening to Jews in Europe? We don't want to be targeted more. We don't want to become the victims even more of anti-Semitism. And others were like, we must talk about it. We must gather. We must have rallies. We must compel action. And it's heartbreaking because, I mean, that type of calculus is one that comes from a place of fear because you have been treated as an other for so long. You have been targeted and persecuted. But one of the things that's really interesting, and I think Iraq is an example of this, and this is where I think like having more informed policy, having policymakers on the ground, having them leave their compounds, and I know you and I and your colleagues have all wrestled with this, is so critically important, because once you do that, you come to see that a lot of the assumptions and perceptions at times are wrong. Yes, there is mistrust against others, but you also see incredible examples of solidarity, of friendship, of a desire to work together to defend each other. And it shows you a kernel of promise of what can be possible. The notion of a pluralistic Iraq is possible, where rights are protected. It can happen. It can be led in many ways by many of the people that we work with. And if we can help strengthen their voice and their hand, we can change the curriculum that kids are taught in Iraq. I mean, we know some basic principles that we can unpack. And I don't want to pretend it's easy. I mean, I think, what has been happening even here in the United States, or I'm from Canada, like in our own history, we know it's difficult to grapple with the past. We know it's difficult to grapple with the commission of crimes, but we can do it. And we need to find creative ways to do that. And I think that helps to, really kind of, as you say, ground it from really back to basics. It's what children are taught, what they're exposed to, how they engage with others. And those are core principles and values that we as an institution also tried to just promote as an institution. That's why ideally, when COVID hopefully lifts, people coming to the museum and learning that history and learning how neighbors can turn on neighbors and how we have to be so vigilant to that. Yazidi colleagues who talked about having some of their own neighbors who are not Yazidi come and kind of point out where Yazidi were living, the violation that they felt, the pain that they felt to know that someone who they had trusted had done that. We need to act as buttresses against that, both in our own communities and help in other communities as well.
One of the Sunni Muslim teachers who participate in our trainings, we've been training teachers across Mosul and the Nineveh Plains where ISIS had held people hostage. And so we're training them in this idea of pluralism and freedom of religion or belief, and how to overcome that hatred that ISIS sowed, and that just violence, towards one another. And one of the teachers, I remember him sharing with us how he was huddled in his home with his two children right next to a Shia mosque. And they were rounding up all the Shia, ISIS was, not just Yazidis, but literally rounded up all the Shia, and then they blew up the building. And he dressed up as a female and he took his children and they escaped. And he was so terrified. He said, I'll never be able to go back in because now the Yazidis are so scared. They're actually attacking us. They're shooting at us if we try to get back in the village after ISIS had left. And he said, we'll never be able to go back in unless everybody learns these principles that you're teaching.
Yeah.
And I just thought, that's why we do what we do, because without that kind of education, those fears, those memories, the trauma, it just festers.
Yeah.
And then if we want to break that cycle of conflict, we've got to help the communities understand that the people that came in, they looked a certain way, but it doesn't mean that every Muslim was like that. So this teacher needed Yazidis to be able to trust him as his neighbor again and not think that just because I'm a Muslim, I'm like ISIS too.
Yeah.
And in the same way, that community needed to learn how to really sympathize and empathize with what the Yazidis experienced. And, you could go across the board, but I mean, we've been very fortunate as an organization to have the support of the government to be able to go into all of these schools and to be teaching. And we do it using fruit because, as you said, it's a very sensitive, difficult topic. So we use fruit and we come in and talk about really difficult topics. But, when you can use something that's as unoffensive as a fruit, it allows you to kind of imagine things in a way that releases a lot of tension. And so we're able to help the victims of trauma work through it in that way. But it's, we all are doing it in different ways to essentially help the people rebuild so that it doesn't happen again and that they're able to find hope in the midst of such a dark place. So the Pope is visiting Iraq right now. It's fascinating. This is the first papal visit to Iraq. So I figured we had to talk about that.
Oh,
and you and I worked on a bill many years ago to recognize that this was genocide. And it's fascinating that, so many years after that was it, starting in 2014, and then finally ISIS was defeated in 2017. But this is the first papal visit for, in my opinion, one of the Christian communities in the world that's probably experienced the most persecution of any of the Christian churches that I've seen in my work in this space in history. So as we know, the Yazidis mentioned that this is the 72nd or 73rd genocide they faced, but for the Christian church there, that, Iraq is the cradle of civilization. It started with Abraham coming out of Ur, which is, in the area of Baghdad. So this is historic. First papal visit. Just what are your thoughts on that? And then I want to talk about the genocide bill that we worked on in Congress too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm incredibly moved by the fact that the Pope has undertaken this trip. And I think the fact that he went also, I know there are, concerns that he went during COVID. I think the fact that he went in such a difficult moment and also a difficult political and security moment really speaks volumes. The thing that I think a lot of people don't necessarily know is that, and this is more just kind of more broadly within the public, is that Christians and other communities were targeted long before ISIS arose. Life had become incredibly difficult for them, which is why millions fled the country. And there were those who were fortunate to be able to go, those who were able to get visas, had family member elsewhere, had the financial resources, but there were many who still couldn't for a whole host of reasons and wouldn't. I am just constantly moved when I think about some of the people I spoke to who, the principled approach that we will not be driven from our homes. We can't envision, and it's mostly within the older generation, an Iraq without Christians, without Yazidis, without these communities. For them, it's so heartbreaking. And it's heartbreaking because all of their children are trying to find ways to leave or have left, but they stay. And I think the Pope going was a remarkable symbol of solidarity for them. It's also remarkable just to see how some of the religious institutions that were destroyed by ISIS or left vacant and eroded have been able to be rebuilt or are in the process of being rebuilt. And there's even historic sites that had been long neglected that are now getting some degree of protection, which I think is really important. But the fact that he also had a very simple message of the need for common humanity to be respected and the need for different communities to come together and see themselves all as Iraqi and as human. The people that he met with in some cases controversial, but critically important to protecting these communities. And also, of course, the fact is the Pope going is a remarkable nudge to actually finally get some legislation passed in Baghdad, and to continue to put sustained pressure on the Iraqi government. They are the ones who bear the primary responsibility to protect these particular communities. They're the ones that have been failing for quite a long time to change the curriculum, for example, that you have to go in and try to do these trainings, and that we have to hope can be scaled up because of the failings of the government. So I thought that the trip in general was incredibly, incredibly important. And I think that, going back to the legislation, one of the things that is hardest and that I find very, very difficult to grapple with, we work with a lot of communities that are trying to protect human rights and advance human rights in Iraq. We work with a lot of organizations that are trying to find ways to continue to document what happened, seek justice, memorialize. The most common refrain when I think of my Yazidi colleagues that we hear is, the world for a short period of time put a focus on us. Genocide determinations were made. In their mind, promises were made, and yet they're still languishing. The last trip I took prior to COVID was I went to northern Iraq, out to Dahuk, where there's a particularly large community of displaced Yazidis. I went back to the same camps that I've been going to since 2015. And people are living in the same, if not worse, conditions. And they don't see the prospect of being able to return back to areas around Mount Sinjar for a host of reasons, security and well-being being one of the biggest. But when I go back to thinking about that period of time that you were talking to, it was dismaying to see how, unfortunately, in a way, political, a conversation that really should have been very straightforward. We had an entity that was quite clear in its intentions and its desires to remove communities, either destroy them as people or entirely displace them from particular areas. And it was disheartening just to see how difficult it was to get the US government to recognize the nature of the crimes. For some reason, crimes against humanity, people are not comfortable saying. The US government doesn't do determinations really of crimes against humanity, which blows my mind. Cambodia, 2 million people killed, crime against humanity. We should be clearly comfortable using this language and also articulating that there are obligations when we talk about crimes against humanity and with genocide. But I'm more curious to hear from you, kind of your experiences on that legislation, because the legislation and the whole government process was so profoundly distressing and humbling. And we're the fortunate ones. We're not the ones who are living in the camps. We're the ones just trying to present basic information and get our colleagues a seat at the table from these communities so that their voices could be heard. So I'd be curious kind of what your perspective is.
Absolutely. It's so interesting you asked that. So when I think I was like 6 months pregnant when ISIS first went into Northern Iraq and was trying to actually get into Erbil. And so people that I had known from my work on the Hill on these issues called me, were like, Tina, we're dying, like, help us. So I'm like, well, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I got on a plane and I went there to see what can I do. And I met with Vienne Dakil, the only Yazidi member of parliament, a woman. And she was good friends with one of my close friends there, who is actually on my board, an Iraqi that was a translator for the US government. Anyway, so I sat with Vienne and she said, we need the US government to recognize this as genocide. If we don't have the US doing it, our government, I won't have the support we need in our own country, which, as you rightly mentioned, is extremely difficult to get. And so, and she was, I mean, you remember her appeals, help us, we are dying. They were literally on the mountain at that point. This was
maybe just for everyone who's listening. I mean, literally, ISIS had been saying for a very long time that they would, especially when they encountered the Yazidi community, basically kill everyone. They had a religious kind of legal interpretation done that said that the Yazidis, who they would refer to as kind of devil worshippers, needed to be kind of destroyed. And as they moved across Nineveh Plain, we were literally seeing community after community being targeted. And then you had hundreds of thousands of Yazidis who basically ran from their homes. And you and I have both heard so many stories from Yazidis, Christians, Kakai, and others about, even, following online on social media where ISIS is attacking and having to run with only the clothing on their backs.
I was in the office of, there were, most people don't know this, there were 7 main Yazidi men that helped coordinate all of the rescues of the Yazidi girls that were held captive by ISIS. And I was with one of them when the girls were still being held in one of the schools in Sinjar, and the girls would call him on the phone. He would give me the phone to hear them crying, just saying, just bomb us, because they were being raped and just brutalized. All the men, there's 18 mass graves with the bodies of young men that they took outside and they destroyed so that they could rape and just destroy these women. And I heard that on the phone. And then, so at that time I came home and I told a colleague in Congressman Trent Frank's office, I said, we need to have a resolution on this. We need to declare it's genocide. And so they worked on that legislation for like 6 months or several months. They were ready to introduce it. And
after the US government's process had stalled.
It takes a long time.
Yeah.
So they were ready to introduce it. They had built a huge coalition with Genocide Watch and all of these, global organizations in the United States, which is necessary to get legislation passed. It was bipartisan. And then another Republican actually introduced a different bill on genocide that didn't mention the Yazidis at all, only mentioned the persecution of Christians. And I can tell you, I remember when he introduced that bill, just thinking, are you kidding me? And everybody rallied around the Christians, but sadly, no one rallied around to help the Yazidis. And I just was so heartbroken because I've worked on these things for years. And I know, number one, you're not going to get anything through in a partisan Congress unless it's bipartisan and unless it's broad-based. And it's not just one group that's being attacked here. Literally, it's many groups. And so I was heartbroken over that. But we worked with Congressman Frank's office to help the congressman that did his own bill to change it and to include the Yazidis through an amendment process. And then we actually brought a Yazidi girl who had survived to the United States to testify in a private hearing before Congress about what happened. And then we worked with our partners in Iraq because the State Department still didn't want to declare it genocide. And by that point, it had become very partisan with groups pitted against each other over the issue of whether it was a Christian genocide or Yazidi genocide or whatever. And so we actually were able to get from some of our translators in Iraq a videotape of ISIS declaring that the jizya tax, which was the main argument being used by the State Department, that they couldn't declare it's genocide because the jizya tax was not, they weren't going to get killed as long as they paid the jizya tax, the Christians, so they weren't really part of the genocide. And so I found a video on the deep net where basically ISIS was saying that the Christians should be killed regardless of whether they pay the jizya or not. Yeah. And so then Congress had put in a requirement that within 90 days or something, they had to declare the genocide. And so then finally they declared it, but that evidence allowed them the ability to do it. And by that point we had rebuilt the coalition. But I know that you had done so much work on that, and I can imagine your frustration and disappointment. And sadly, this is what a lot of people outside Washington don't see. When people, it's just, to me, this is not about one group. This is about the people in Iraq who I have worked with for many years.
Yeah.
They were looking for someone to be a voice for them, and partisan politics got in the way, and that the people that did that should be ashamed of themselves, in my opinion.
What's unfortunate was that it pitted communities against communities, and the reality is that all communities had suffered immensely.
Right.
As an institution, we think that it's important to kind of call things what they are. But what we also think is really important is that people understand that when we're talking about crimes on this scale, be it genocide or crimes against humanity, to kind of, distill things down to just kind of a legal definition, that is, the crimes have already happened. I mean, you're arguing something after the point. And what we need to see is people act at a much earlier stage, and also recognize that it is a problem that, I had to go into areas where ISIS was to be able to interview people and document what was happening, that you had to go and do that, that you had to get this information off the dark net. We put in our first report that a lot more information is needed. A lot of information is needed about what happened to Shia communities as well, because that is a part of everything that has transpired that we just don't really know enough. And these communities are understandably, reluctant to disclose a lot of incredibly painful things that happen, especially when it comes to gender-based violence. So there's still so many unknowns, but to kind of have it being either, these kind of very siloed approaches to suffering was really shocking and disturbing to see when we're talking in the context of such extreme suffering across the board. And it's interesting because I didn't know the full extent of the background that you just outlined right there. What also says a lot, though, is that the one congressman that you're talking about, the constituency has the largest Yazidi constituency in the United States. So that also is interesting because we often think that helps to inform considerations and decisions. Thankfully, there's been robust attention since then. So, I really commend you and your organization and a lot of others who've worked to try to make sure that there is attention across the board for various communities that were targeted. But it was a really painful period, especially because the suffering was just so acute across the board. And you mentioned just about kind of what happened with the Yazidi community in general, and just for those who are listening, because the Pope also raised the Yazidi, it is so important because they were such a misunderstood community within Iraq, and their religion is profoundly misunderstood. But when the hundreds of thousands fled to the mountain, they were at the top of the mountain. ISIS had encircled the entire mountain and was basically killing anyone who was trying to flee and anyone who kind of was at a particular level. And that's when Beyond Akil went to the Iraqi parliament. She was a member of parliament and basically said, they're going to kill us all. Please do something. And that compelled the Iraqi government to ask the US government for assistance. The US government then helped with some aerial bombardment. Forces on the ground, actually, that were in neighboring country came and also helped to create a pathway so people could run. But as you said, what is absolutely horrific is that ISIS captured thousands of women, girls, in some cases men, and held them in various locations, schools, transferred them to a large location in Tal Afar. And during that entire time, people were making phone calls, as you said. People were sharing their locations. There are a number of Yazidi who were former interpreters for the US government and were literally giving precise coordinates. And, my heart goes out to them. I, like you, have heard so many personal accounts where people said, please, they asked to be bombed. They asked to be put out of their misery, or where they saw jets overhead and they thought that someone was going to come save them. And it, when confronted and when getting that information and you kind of in the moment, then having to navigate the politics of genocide, the politics of crimes against humanity, we're facing it now, in the context of the Rohingya, in the context of the Uyghurs. And sometimes you just want to say, gosh, these are lives that we're talking about. Let's keep focused on that, not on what the specific language of what you call it is, or on which community has suffered more when everyone has suffered. I think it's important that we have an accurate historical record and we know what happened. But these should not become political issues that get jockeyed around. So I appreciate you just sharing your experience, because I didn't know the insides.
Yeah, and I misstated it. The person I worked with in his office, she started working on it in the spring of 2014 because we had seen ISIS moving in and already doing a number of things. So it was actually, it predated even being with BN that we had begun working on that legislation. And then I met with her when, I mean, because everything happened so quickly, as you knew. I mean, they gave
Was
the
you?
Christians 48 hours to get out of Mosul and the Nineveh plains, and then they literally overnight descended on the Yazidis and gave them zero warning. And so I was there literally 2 weeks after they started going to the Yazidis, but we had already been prepared. And then I came home, and that's when,
That's
yeah,
wonderful. I mean,
everything
it's
kind of,
an example, again, we in our first report talked about, again, just like ample early warning that was missed, including early warning that, the reality is when US troops pulled out of Nineveh, the threats and the vulnerabilities that these communities faced skyrocketed. And the attacks against them had skyrocketed too, which I think, there's a lot of, from a historical perspective, there's a lot that we need to kind of evaluate, learn from. I think the biggest kind of responsibility that all of us have right now is to try to do everything we can to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And to recognize that these same communities remain very, very vulnerable today. We have seen no resolution to the disputed areas, which is where many of these communities lived in Nineveh. There are land grabs. There is so much that is taking place that doesn't bode well for the future of these communities. And what I always hope that people know is that, it's good that there's moments, and it's critically important for moments like the Pope visiting. But in a week from now, when he is gone and there aren't stories about Iraq, those communities, they will remain as vulnerable as they are today. So we have to continue to kind of stand in solidarity with them and try to create a better future.
yeah. And if we, I mean, my perspective is if we can spend trillions of dollars on conflict and humanitarian responses, we can spend a little bit of money to prevent them too, so
Yeah.
that those lives are not lost, that those people don't lose their homes, that they're not forced to relocate. This
Yeah.
is this is one of the most historic
Yeah.
parts of the world that we should all be concerned about. It's a symbol. It should be a symbol of pluralism. I mean, with the Pope visiting, some of the first dialogues between Christians and Muslims took place in Iraq, between the bishop and the caliphate at the time. I mean, these are things that should still be happening in our world, and I think there's a real opportunity there. And I'm really excited about the work that you're continuing to do, and I hope that everybody that's listening will follow it and watch it closely and visit the museum when they can. This is just so important, and a part of this is so that people won't forget, so that they can. They often don't hear kind of the underbelly of what's happening or how people are navigating it, and I hope that this encourages them to know that we can think ahead, we can help prepare, we can stop things, we can engage our lawmakers. There's so much more we can do, but people in the world, like in Iraq, they look to us to be that voice of that for them when they don't have one. And so please use your voice. I mean,
Yeah.
more than anything, be
Yeah.
that voice for them, and don't let it be squashed or silenced.
Yeah.
So
The thing that struck me so often in Iraq is just, with the communities that we were working with, so many people had ties to the United States. So many people also looked to the United States as a symbol of, a life that they hope to have. And you talked about the history and the rich history. There is a old synagogue in a town called Al Kush, in northern Iraq that is in the process of now being preserved by archaeologists. But the part of the origin story is that the Nahum basically prophesies the end of a particular kind of era and people. And what I think about is, for thousands of years, we've seen communities imperiled, and we have the opportunity now to learn from those thousands of years of history on how to make sure that we don't keep repeating it, because these are human beings that we're talking about. They're people who shared with us stories of wanting to go to law school, of wanting to finish high school, of having been a teacher who taught kids from all different backgrounds. They had their day-to-day lives that, in many ways are no different than ours, and they need to be allowed to continue to thrive as people and as communities. And if we can be incredibly idealistic, my hope is that in some way in the future, those who did flee and those who have left the country feel that it is a place that at one stage they can return to.
Yeah. Well, and that will be the great success story if we can get there. So, Naomi, thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing your story and for all the work that you're doing. I just can't tell you how much I respect it, and I'm just honored to be able to share with people.
Likewise, and I really hope that as you have a lot of support for Hardwired. The work that you're doing is really remarkable. I think both of our organizations, most of our work is completely behind the scenes, so we don't talk a lot about it or put a spotlight on it. But your work really does make a very, very big difference, and you have a fantastic team, small but mighty. So that is it's really been a pleasure.
Thank you, Naomi.